The morning sun was just peeking through the clouds as Maria adjusted her headscarf and prepared herself for another long day. Life as a maid had never been easy, but it was honest work, and allowed her to put food on the table for her small family, what was left of it at least. Ever since the accident 2 years ago, the accident that had shattered her world and taken her son, Adrian, away, Maria had been living a shadow of the life she once knew. Adrian was her light, her joy, and losing him felt like losing a piece of her soul. Today, however, something felt different. The agency had called the night before with a new assignment, a temporary position at one of the most lavish estates in the city. The owner, a reclusive billionaire named Mr. Armand, was known for his wealth and eccentric lifestyle, but little else. Maria wasn't sure what to expect, but the promise of double her usual pay was enough to convince her to take the job. When she arrived at the towering gates of the estate, her breath caught in her throat. The mansion was like something out of a movie. Glass walls glinting in the sunlight, manicured gardens stretching endlessly, and luxury cars parked in neat rows. She couldn't help but feel out of place as she stepped inside, clutching her worn-out bag tightly. The housekeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Collins, greeted Maria with a polite but distant smile. "You'll be working in the East Wing," she said briskly. "Mr. Armand has guests staying over, and we need everything spotless." Maria nodded and followed her down the grand hallways, trying not to gape at the sheer opulence around her. As the day went on, Maria threw herself into her work, scrubbing floors and polishing surfaces until they gleamed. She barely noticed the other staff bustling around her or the occasional sound of laughter drifting from the dining room. But then, as she stepped into the library to dust the shelves, something caught her eye, a photograph sitting on the desk. Her heart stopped. The boy in the photo was smiling brightly, his dark hair tousled and his eyes full of life. It was Adrian, her Adrian. Maria's hands trembled as she picked up the frame, her mind racing. It couldn't be. Adrian was gone. She had seen his lifeless body at the hospital, had buried him with her own hands. And yet, here he was, looking alive and happy, in a house that was worlds away from their modest home. Before she could gather her thoughts, the door behind her creaked open. She turned sharply, clutching the photo to her chest, and froze. Standing there, with the same familiar eyes and hesitant smile, was the boy she had lost. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Maria felt the room spin around her as tears welled up in her eyes. How was this possible? What was he doing here? And why was he calling her Mom like he hadn't been gone for 2 years? Her legs felt weak, but before she could take a step toward him, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. The boy's expression turned to fear, and he quickly motioned for her to stay quiet. "Please," he said urgently, "you can't let them know you saw me." Maria's heart pounded in her chest as the door swung open once more, revealing a tall, imposing figure. It was Mr. Armand himself, his piercing gaze sweeping over the room. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with authority. Maria quickly hid the photo behind her back, her mind racing. She didn't know what was going on, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning of a story she never saw coming. Maria froze under Mr. Armand's piercing gaze, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She couldn't let him suspect anything. She forced a shaky smile and quickly lowered her eyes, hoping he wouldn't notice the way her hands trembled. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just dusting the shelves." Mr. Armand's sharp eyes scanned the room, lingering for a moment on her before moving past her. Maria felt the boy's presence like a weight in the room, though he had slipped silently behind the shelves when the door opened. "Good," Mr. Armand said, his tone curt. "Make sure the library is spotless. I have guests arriving later, and I want everything to be perfect." "Of course, sir," Maria said, nodding quickly. He gave her one last look before turning and leaving the room. As soon as the door closed behind him, Maria exhaled shakily, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. She clutched the edge of the desk for support, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her son, her Adrian, was alive. But how? Why was he here, living in this mansion, hiding like a ghost in the shadows? And why had he told her not to say anything? Maria's mind raced with questions as she glanced toward the corner where the boy had disappeared. But he was gone now, leaving her alone with her confusion, and the photograph still clutched tightly in her hand. She stared at the smiling face in the picture, her heart aching with a mixture of joy and fear. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Maria went through the motions of her work, scrubbing and polishing while her thoughts churned. She replayed the moment in the library over and over, trying to piece together the puzzle. But no matter how much she tried to make sense of it, She was left with more questions than answers. By the time the sun began to set, Maria's nerves were frayed. She couldn't leave without seeing Adrian again, couldn't go home without understanding what was happening. As the staff gathered in the kitchen to finish up for the day, she lingered at the back, her eyes darting toward the grand staircase. "Maria," Mrs. Collins called, snapping her out of her thoughts. "You can leave now. Be back tomorrow morning at 7 sharp." "Yes, ma'am," Maria said, forcing a smile. She waited until the others had filed out before making her way back toward the east wing. The halls were quiet now, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the plush carpets. Her heart pounded as she approached the library, half expecting to see Mr. Armand or one of the other staff. But the room was empty. "Adrian?" she whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from behind one of the bookshelves, a small figure emerged. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she saw her son step into the light, his face pale but unmistakably his. "Mum," he said again, his voice breaking. Maria rushed forward, pulling him into her arms. She held him tightly, as if afraid he might disappear again. Tears streamed down her face as she clung to him, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions. "I thought I lost you," she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. "I thought you were gone forever." "I'm sorry, Mum," Adrian said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I didn't want you to think that. I didn't want you to hurt." Maria pulled back, holding his face in her hands as she looked into his eyes. "What happened, Adrian? How are you here? Why didn't you come home?" Adrian glanced toward the door, his expression tense. "I can't explain everything right now," he said hurriedly. "It's not safe. They're watching." "Who's watching?" Maria asked, her voice rising with panic. "What's going on, Adrian? Please tell me." "I can't," he said, shaking his head. "Not here, but I promise I'll explain everything soon. Just trust me, Mom." Maria wanted to demand answers, to press him until he told her everything. But the fear in his eyes stopped her. She could see that he was scared, terrified even, and she didn't want to make it worse. "Okay," she said softly, brushing his hair back. "Okay, I'll wait, but promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come to me when you're ready." "I promise," Adrian said, his voice firm despite the fear. Before Maria could say anything else, they heard footsteps approaching from the hall. Adrian's eyes widened, and he quickly stepped back, disappearing into the shadows. Maria turned just as the door opened, her heart racing. It was Mrs. Collins, looking at her with a frown. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I told you to leave for the day." "I'm sorry," Maria said quickly, forcing a nervous smile. "I just wanted to finish up in the library. I'll go now." Mrs. Collins gave her a suspicious look but didn't press further. "Make sure you lock up behind you," she said before turning and walking away. Maria waited until the sound of her footsteps faded before leaving the library. Her mind was spinning, but she knew she couldn't stay any longer without drawing more attention. As she walked out of the mansion and into the cool evening air, she felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. She had found her son. He was alive. But something was very, very wrong, and she didn't know how to fix it. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Maria couldn't shake the image of Adrian's face, the fear in his eyes, the urgency in his voice. She had so many questions, but one thing was clear. She would do whatever it took to protect him, to bring him back home where he belonged. But as she drifted into a restless sleep, one thought haunted her more than any other. Who was watching them, and why? The next morning, Maria arrived at the mansion earlier than usual. She couldn't shake the weight in her chest or the questions swirling in her mind. She had barely slept, haunted by Adrian's frightened expression and his cryptic words. Every step through the estate felt heavier, her thoughts a storm of worry and determination. She needed to find a way to talk to Adrian again, to understand what was happening and why he was so afraid. The staff gathered in the kitchen as Mrs. Collins handed out tasks for the day. Maria kept her head down, hoping to avoid drawing attention. She was assigned to clean the guest rooms in the west wing, far from the library where she had seen Adrian. Her heart sank, but she forced herself to nod and head upstairs, deciding she would find a way to step away later. The west wing was even grander than the east, with high ceilings and rooms filled with antique furniture and sparkling chandeliers. As Maria worked, she couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation from the guests staying in the mansion. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices carrying a weight of secrecy. "Did you hear about the boy?" one man whispered as he passed by with another guest. "The one Mr. Armand took in," the second man replied. Maria paused, her grip tightening on the cloth in her hand. She leaned closer to the door, straining to hear more. "Yes," the first man said. I don't know why he's keeping the boy hidden, but there's something strange about it. The staff won't say a word. It's like they're all scared of him." Maria's heart raced as she listened, her mind racing with possibilities. Was Adrian the boy they were talking about? Why would Mr. Armand take him in? And what did they mean by hidden? The voices faded as the men walked down the hall, leaving Maria alone with her thoughts. She finished cleaning the room quickly, her mind made up. She couldn't wait until the end of the day to figure out what was going on. She needed answers now. As soon as she finished her assigned tasks, Maria slipped away, heading back toward the east wing. She avoided the other staff as best as she could, her heart pounding with every step. When she reached the library, it was empty, but she didn't stop there. Something told her Adrian wouldn't be hiding in the same place twice. She searched quietly, moving through the winding halls and checking every room she passed. Finally, in a small sitting room tucked away at the far end of the mansion, she found him. Adrian was sitting on a window seat, staring out at the garden below. He looked so small and vulnerable, his shoulders slumped as if carrying a heavy burden. "Adrian," Maria whispered, stepping into the room. He turned quickly, his eyes wide with surprise and fear. "Mom, you can't be here," he said urgently, standing up. "Adrian, please," Maria said, her voice breaking. "I need to know what's going on. Why are you here? Why are you hiding?" Adrian hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to barge in at any moment. Finally, he sighed and sat back down, motioning for Maria to join him. "I don't know everything," he admitted, his voice low. "But Mr. Armand, he found me after the accident. He told me I couldn't go back to you, that it wasn't safe." "Not safe?" Maria repeated, her stomach twisting. "Why would he say that? What is he keeping you from?" "I don't know," Adrian said, shaking his head. "He doesn't tell me much, but I've heard things. Conversations late at night, people talking about deals and secrets. I think he's using me for something, Mom. I just don't know what." Maria's hands clenched into fists as anger and fear swirled inside her. She couldn't believe this. Her son had been taken from her, kept away with lies and manipulation. But why? What could Mr. Armand possibly gain from keeping Adrian hidden? Before she could ask more, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Adrian's eyes widened, and he quickly pushed Maria toward a small alcove behind the curtain. "Hide," he whispered. Maria pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding as the door creaked open. "Adrian," came a deep, smooth voice. It was Mr. Armand. Maria held her breath, peeking through the small gap in the curtain. She saw Adrian standing stiffly by the window, his hands clenched at his sides. "Yes, sir," Adrian said, his voice calm but strained. Mr. Armand stepped further into the room, his tall frame and sharp features casting an imposing shadow. He studied Adrian for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You've been spending a lot of time wandering the halls," he said, his tone casual but carrying an edge of warning. "I just needed some air," Adrian replied. Mr. Armand's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press further. "Dinner will be served soon. You should get ready. Our guests will expect you to be present." "Yes, sir," Adrian said, nodding quickly. With one last glance around the room, Mr. Armand turned and left, closing the door behind him. Maria waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before stepping out from behind the curtain. "Adrian, you need to tell me everything," she said, her voice urgent. "Why is he making you stay here? What does he want from you?" "I don't know, Mum," Adrian said, his voice trembling. "But I think it has something to do with Dad." Maria froze, her blood running cold. Adrian's father had died when he was a baby, leaving Maria to raise him on her own. What could Mr. Armand possibly have to do with him? "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard him talking about Dad once," Adrian said. "He said something about debts and unfinished business. I don't understand it, but I think it's why he won't let me leave." Maria's mind reeled as she tried to make sense of this new information. Her late husband had always been a good man, hardworking and kind. What kind of connection could he have had to a man like Mr. Armand? Before she could ask more, Adrian grabbed her hand. "You need to go, Mom," he said urgently. "If he finds you here, it'll only make things worse." Reluctantly, Maria nodded, knowing he was right. But as she slipped out of the room and made her way back to the servants' quarters, she made a silent promise to herself. She would uncover the truth, no matter what it took. Maria barely slept that night, her mind spinning with Adrian's words, debts and unfinished business. What did Mr. Armand want with her son, and how was her late husband connected to all of this? Every question only led to more confusion, but one thing was clear. Adrian was trapped, and Maria had to find a way to get him out. The next morning, she arrived at the mansion determined to uncover the truth. She moved through her tasks as usual, careful not to draw any suspicion. But her ears were sharp, catching every snippet of conversation and every movement that might give her a clue. The air in the house felt heavier than usual, a quiet tension that made her nerves prickle. As she polished the mirrors in the grand hallway, she heard voices coming from Mr. Armand's study. The door was slightly ajar, and she hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. She could hear Mr. Armand speaking, his tone low and serious. "You understand the importance of keeping this quiet," he said. "If anyone finds out, it could ruin everything." Another voice, deeper and unfamiliar, responded, "I still think it's risky. The boy is a liability. Someone will notice eventually." Maria's heart raced as she strained to hear more, but the voices dropped even lower. She risked leaning closer to the door, her breath held. "That's why we need to finalize the deal," Mr. Armand said. "Once it's done, the boy won't matter anymore." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. Finalize the deal? What deal? And what did he mean by "the boy won't matter"? She stepped back quickly, her pulse pounding in her ears. Whatever Mr. Armand was planning, it was dangerous, and Adrian was at the center of it. The rest of the day passed in a haze as Maria tried to piece together what she had overheard. She couldn't confront Mr. Armand directly, not without risking Adrian's safety. But she also couldn't stand by and do nothing. She needed more information, and she knew the only way to get it was to dig deeper, no matter the risk. That evening, as the staff began to leave for the day, Maria stayed behind, claiming she had extra work to finish. She waited until the house was quiet before making her way back to Mr. Armand's study. The door was locked, but she had noticed earlier that one of the windows on the side of the house was slightly open. Slipping outside, she crept around the mansion, her heart pounding with every step. The gardens were eerily still in the fading light, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes. When she reached the study window, she carefully pushed it open and climbed inside, landing softly on the plush carpet. The room was dimly lit, and the faint scent of cigars lingered in the air. Maria's eyes darted around, searching for anything that might give her a clue. The desk was cluttered with papers, and she quickly began sifting through them, her hands shaking. Most of the documents were business contracts and financial records, but one file caught her eye. It was labeled with a name she hadn't heard in years, her husband's name. Maria's breath hitched as she opened the file. Inside were pages of notes, bank statements, and correspondence, all tied to her husband. There were mentions of a failed business venture, loans taken out in desperation, and payments that had never been made. At the bottom of one letter, she saw Mr. Armand's signature. Tears filled Maria's eyes as the pieces began to fall into place. Her husband must have been involved with Mr. Armand somehow, caught up in debts he couldn't repay. But why would that lead to Adrian being taken? None of it made sense. Before she could read further, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Maria's heart leaped into her throat as she quickly stuffed the papers back into the file and slid it into her bag. She barely had time to close the desk drawer before the door handle turned. She dove behind the curtains, pressing herself against the wall as the door opened. Mr. Armand's voice carried into the room, low and frustrated. "I don't care how long it takes," he said, his tone sharp. "Find the buyer and make sure the boy stays under control until then." Maria's blood ran cold. A buyer? Were they trying to sell Adrian? The thought made her stomach churn with rage and fear. She stayed hidden as Mr. Armand moved through the room, muttering to himself. After what felt like an eternity, he finally left, slamming the door behind him. Maria waited a few more seconds before slipping out from behind the curtain and climbing back out the window. As she made her way home that night, her thoughts were a whirlwind of panic and determination. Mr. Armand wasn't just keeping Adrian away. He was planning something far more sinister. Whatever the deal was, it involved selling Adrian, and Maria knew she didn't have much time to stop it. But how could she fight someone as powerful as Mr. Armand? She was just a maid, a grieving mother who had stumbled into a world far beyond her understanding. Still, as she clutched the file in her bag, she felt a spark of hope. She had the truth now, and she would use it to protect her son. Maria spent the night poring over the documents, piecing together the story of her husband's involvement with Mr. Armand. The more she read, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about debts. There was something else, something bigger, hidden beneath the surface. By the time the sun rose, Maria had made her decision. She wouldn't wait for Mr. Armand to make his move. She would confront him, expose his plans, and do whatever it took to bring Adrian home. But as she prepared herself for the battle ahead, a gnawing fear lingered in the back of her mind. What if she was already too late?